Before they destroyed themselves, the Eldari ruled everything. Millions of years of perfection, and it still wasn't enough. They wanted more. They built a god from their own desires. And when it was born, it ate them. Trillions of souls screaming into the warp in a single moment. This is what happened when excess became divine. There are civilizations that rise and fall within the span of a star's lifetime. There are empires that burn brightly and collapse into ash before the echo of their first triumph fades. And then there are those that endure so long, grow so vast that their death becomes inevitable, not through conquest or cataclysm, but through the slow, inexorable rod of perfection itself. The Eldari was such an empire long before humanity crawled from the mud of ancient terror. Before the first orc war bands tore across the stars, before even the Necroneer surrendered their flesh to become the Undying, the Eldari stood as the uncontested masters of the galaxy. Theirs was not dominion earned through war, though they were capable of it. Theirs was not supremacy claimed through faith, though their gods walked among them. Theirs was the rule of those who had transcended necessity itself. They had bent reality to their will so completely that struggle became a memory, survival a forgotten concern, and existence itself a canvas upon which they could paint any desire. They had no need to toil. Their technologies were wonders that predated the Imperium's oldest relics. Machines so advanced they seemed to operate not through circuitry and logic, but through the dreams of their makers. Wraithbone constructs grown from psychic intent rather than forged. Weapons that killed not with crude matter, but with unraveling coherence. Ships that danced through the webway. An ancient network of tunnels carved through the spaces between reality, allowing them to traverse the galaxy without ever touching the void. They shaped worlds with thought. They extended lifespans into millennia. They gazed into the warp and saw not madness, but potential. For millions of years, they thrived, but all perfect things contain the seed of their undoing. The earliest generations of Eldari knew hardship. They fought the Necrontyr in the wars that would birth the Satan and see the galaxy bleed. They struggled against entropy and hostile Xenos and the raw chaos of an untamed universe. But with each victory, each advancement, that struggle diminished. With each generation, necessity retreated further, and in its absence something else began to grow. Boredom. Not the simple restlessness of a child awaiting entertainment, but the existential hollowness that comes when every challenge has been overcome, every question answered, every frontier mapped. The Eldari had conquered death, bent matter, and walked among gods. What remained? At first, they turned to art. Entire worlds became galleries, symphonies that lasted centuries. Sculptures carved from living stone that wept and sang. They pursued beauty with the same ferocity their ancestors had pursued survival. And for a time it sustained them. But beauty too became routine. They turned to philosophy, to the exploration of consciousness itself. Psychic disciplines that allowed them to perceive the thoughts of stars, to dream in colors that had no names, to experience existence from perspectives beyond mortal comprehension. They walked through memories as easily as corridors. They reshaped their own emotions, heightening joy, dulling sorrow, crafting inner worlds more vivid than the material realm. And still, it was not enough. So they pushed further. The great cities of the Eldari core worlds became labyrinths of indulgence. Towers of crystal and wraithbone reached toward skies painted in shades no human eye could perceive. Within those towers, pleasure became pursuit. Neural stimulators allowed experiences beyond the body's capacity. Entire districts were dedicated to sensation refined into sacrament. What began as appreciation became obsession. What began as exploration became addiction. They no longer created art, they consumed it. They no longer sought knowledge, they devoured it. Every experience had to surpass the last. Every sensation had to be sharper, deeper, more exquisite than the one before. Moderation became weakness. Restraint became failure. The society fractured slowly like ice cracking across a frozen lake. Not all Eldari followed the path into decadence. There were those who saw the danger, who recognized the spiritual rot spreading through their civilization. These were the ones who would become the Exodites, those who abandoned the glory of the empire for primitive worlds at the galaxy's edge. They traded psychic mastery for communion with world spirits, vast entities dwelling within virgin planets. They chose simplicity over sophistication, survival over supremacy. The rest of their kind mocked them as cowards, as regressive fools clinging to an imagined past. The core worlds had no need for such primitiveness. The core worlds had transcended such limitations. The core worlds did not understand that limitations are what keep the soul intact in the great amphitheaters of the Aldari throne worlds. Performances became rituals. Actors no longer portrayed emotion. They induced it, broadcast it, forced audiences to experience sensation directly through psychic link. A tragedy was no longer watched. It was felt, lived, endured as if the suffering were your own. A romance was not observed. It was consumed. The participants' ecstasy flooding through the minds of thousands. The crowds grew larger. The experiences grew more intense, and the boundaries between performer and audience, between observer and participant began to blur. There were those who spent months locked in neural cradles, experiencing lifetimes of sensation compressed into heartbeats. There were cults dedicated to the refinement of pain, not as punishment, but as art form. Their practitioners seeking the perfect agony the way a sculptor seeks the perfect curve. There were pleasure districts where Allery wandered like ghosts, their minds so fractured by overstimulation that they could no longer distinguish memory from reality, fantasy from flesh. And through it all, in the space beyond space, in the rowing nightmare realm of the immaterium, something began to stir. The warp is not empty. It has never been empty. It is a reflection of the material universe, a dimension of thought and emotion given form. Every fear, every joy, every moment of rage or love or despair ripples through the warp like a stone cast into water. For most species, these ripples are faint, barely perceptible. But the Eldari were psychically potent beyond measure. Their every thought burned bright in the immaterium. Their emotions were storms. And now those storms were converging. Excess breeds excess. Obsession feeds obsession. With every indulgence, with every boundary shattered in pursuit of sensation, the Aldari were pouring energy into the warp. Not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably, the immaterium began to coalesce around their collective desires, their hungers, their endless, insatiable need for more. A shadow formed in the deep warp. Shapeless at first, formless, but growing, the seers were the first to notice. Those Eldari gifted with foresight, who could peer through time's veil and perceive futures yet unwritten. They began to experience visions that left them screaming, dreams of something vast and hungry, something that wore their own faces, something that whispered in voices they recognized as their own. They saw cities consumed not by fire, but by ecstasy. They saw souls unraveling into strands of pleasure and agony indistinguishable from one another. They tried to warn the others. No one listened. Why would they? The seers had always been prone to dramatic pronouncements. Their warnings had grown increasingly apocalyptic over the centuries. Yet, the empire endured. The pleasures continued. Life, such as it was, went on. The cults grew bolder. What had once been hidden in shadowed districts now spilled into the open. Processions of devotees wandered the streets. Their bodies modified into living art. Their minds lost to sensation. Entire cities became theaters of the grotesque, where morality was a relic and restraint a myth. Rival factions competed not for resources or territory, but for the perfection of experience. One cult sought to induce every possible emotion simultaneously. Another pursued the eradication of all feeling, believing that numbness was the final frontier. A third declared that only through the complete dissolution of self could true enlightenment be achieved. They were all correct. They were all damned. The aristocracy, the rulers who had once guided the Aldari with wisdom earned over millennia, now presided over courts where policy was determined by whim and decree was indistinguishable from depravity. Laws were rewritten daily, then discarded. Hierarchies dissolved. The very concept of governance became performance art. Entire councils convened solely to experience the sensation of power, then dissolved when the novelty faded. On some worlds, order collapsed entirely.